1968, Chevrolet released the C3 Corvette. It became one of the most iconic American sports cars of all time. Magazines called it a masterpiece. Collectors still pay six figures for a clean one today. But here's the thing nobody tells you. That Corvette wasn't designed by Chevrolet. It was taken from Pontiac. In 1985, a stainless steel sports car called the DMC-12 became the most famous time machine in cinema history, thanks to Back to the Future. The whole world fell in love with it. But the man who built it never lived to see that moment of triumph. His company had been gone for 3 years. In 1993, Pontiac released the fourth-generation Firebird. That aggressive twin-nostril front end became the face of an entire era of American muscle. That car was supposed to be called Banshee. 3 legendary cars, one forgotten name behind all of them, and one man who was about to become the CEO of General Motors before he walked out the door and threw it all away. His name was John DeLorean. This is the story of the Pontiac Banshee XP-833, the forgotten Corvette killer. GM shut down, then quietly used to build a Corvette of their own. In 1956, General Motors was the largest industrial empire on Earth. The year before, they had become the first American company to ever earn $1 billion in profit. Half of Detroit was on their payroll. Their factories ran around the clock. Their cars defined the American dream. But inside this giant, one division was quietly fading away. It was called Pontiac. In an era of tail fins and chrome, when every American kid wanted speed and style and excitement, Pontiac sold reliability. Their cars didn't break down. That was the entire pitch. Forbes magazine quoted author J. Patrick Wright with a single devastating phrase about Pontiac. He called it an old person's division. 3 words, a perfect epitaph for a brand that was running out of time. Just as the executives at GM were preparing to write Pontiac's obituary, a 31-year-old engineer walked through the door. He had jumped over from Packard. He wore tailored Italian suits in an era when GM executives were required to wear dark suits, white shirts, and muted ties. He dyed his hair black. He dated supermodels. He played the saxophone. He didn't fit in. His name was John Z. DeLorean, and in 9 years, he was going to drag Pontiac out of the grave and turn it into the most exciting brand in America. When DeLorean joined Pontiac in 1956, General Motors offered him a salary of $16,000 a year. $16,000. You need to understand what that number meant in 1956. The average American worker that year earned about $4,700. A Pontiac dealer making a decent living took home maybe $7,000. A small-town doctor, about $10,000. DeLorean was being paid more than 3 average families combined to work as an assistant engineer. Adjusted for inflation, that's nearly $200,000 a year in today's money to start at the bottom of the engineering ladder. GM had never paid that kind of money for an entry-level position. Ever. But DeLorean wasn't there for the money. He was there because the man who hired him, a 42-year-old executive named Bunky Knudsen, the youngest division chief in GM history, had whispered something in his ear during the interview. He had told DeLorean, "You can do whatever you want here, as long as you save Pontiac." That was the deal. Save the dying brand. Make it exciting again. Make it sell. In return, DeLorean would have something almost no engineer in Detroit had: total creative freedom inside the world's biggest car company. It was the deal of a lifetime. It was also the trap that would define the rest of his life. It was a Saturday afternoon in 1963. The Milford Proving Grounds, GM's test facility outside Detroit, was nearly empty. DeLorean was there with two engineers, a man named Bill Collins, who would later become the father of the Pontiac GTO, and another engineer named Russ G. They were looking at a 1964 Pontiac Tempest, a mid-sized car with a small 326 cubic inch V8 under the hood. That's when Bill Collins said the sentence that would change American automotive history. He pointed at the engine bay and said, "The 389 will fit." It was a casual comment, the kind of thing engineers say to each other on a slow Saturday afternoon. But everyone in that garage understood the weight of it. The 389 was Pontiac's big block V8. It was the engine they put in their full-size land yachts. Heavy, expensive, gentlemen's club cars. Putting that engine into a small, light Tempest would create something nobody in America had ever seen before. A small car with a massive engine. A street weapon disguised as a family sedan. There was just one problem. General Motors had a corporate rule on the books. It said no GM car could have an engine displacement greater than 1 cubic inch for every 10 pounds of vehicle weight. The Tempest was too light. The 389 was too big. The math didn't work. Under normal circumstances, that would have been the end of the conversation. But DeLorean wasn't a normal executive. He read the rule again, carefully, and he found something nobody else had noticed. The rule applied to standard base model engines. It said nothing about optional engines. So if Pontiac sold the 389 as an optional package, as an upgrade you had to specifically request, the rule didn't apply. It was a loophole big enough to drive a muscle car through. A week later, the first prototype was running. They tested it on the back roads outside Detroit. It was unholy. It was magnificent. It was, quite literally, against the rules. In September 1963, Pontiac released it to the public as the GTO, an option package on the Tempest, named after the Ferrari 250 GTO racing car. It sold 32,000 units in the first year. By the second year, it was a phenomenon. But it wasn't just a successful car. It was the spark that lit the fuse on the entire American muscle car era. Before the GTO, there were fast cars. After the GTO, there was a movement. Ford rushed out the Mustang. Dodge built the Charger. Plymouth answered with the Roadrunner. Chevrolet eventually responded with the Chevelle SS and the Camaro. An entire generation of American performance cars. The cars that would define a decade. The cars that today sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars at Barrett-Jackson auctions. They all trace their lineage back to that single Saturday afternoon in 1963. To 3 engineers. A loophole in a rule book. And one man named John DeLorean who refused to follow the rules. By 1965, DeLorean was promoted to general manager of the entire Pontiac division. At 40 years old, he was the youngest division chief in General Motors history. He had done what he was hired to do. He had saved Pontiac. But for DeLorean, the GTO was just the beginning. Because there was another car. A car nobody outside GM had ever seen. A car that DeLorean believed could change the entire American sports car market forever. It was a small, lightweight, 2-seater coupe. designed to do what no Pontiac had ever done before. Designed to take down the Chevrolet Corvette. It had an internal code name, XP-833. DeLorean didn't give up. In 1966, less than a year after the XP-833 was canceled, he tried again. This time, he built something completely different. A four-seater Grand Tourer. A Pontiac 421 cubic inch V8 under the hood. Independent suspension on all four wheels. Doors that didn't open outward. They slid parallel to the body, opening up a 20-inch wide gap to make it easier to climb in. And on top, a pair of gull-wing panels that lifted to give passengers access to the rear seats. It looked like a spaceship. The internal code was XP-798. But this one had a name from day one. DeLorean called it the Banshee. The name came from a fighter aircraft used by the U.S. Navy in the early 1950s. Aggressive, fast, American. The plan was to unveil the Banshee XP-798 at the 1966 New York Auto Show. The press release was already written. The reservation for the floor space had already been paid. The car was sitting in a crate, ready to ship. And then, less than 24 hours before the show opened, it was pulled. The order came directly from James Roach, the same GM president who had killed the XP-833 a year earlier. His official reason was that the name Banshee was inappropriate. In Irish folklore, a banshee is a spirit whose wail announces death. Roach didn't want a Pontiac car associated with that kind of imagery. It was a strange reason, suspiciously strange, because everyone in the room knew the real reason. The XP-798 had a 421 V8 in a lightweight body. It would have outrun a Corvette on any track. Again. The car was buried in storage. The prototype was eventually crushed, but the name didn't die. A few months later, Pontiac was developing its answer to the Ford Mustang. They needed a name for the upcoming pony car. The name on the shortlist? Banshee. Once again, Roach stepped in. Banshee was rejected. Too dark. Too foreboding. So they picked something else. Something safer. Something, Roach thought, more American. They called it the Pontiac Firebird. That's right. The car that became one of the most iconic American muscle cars of the 1960s and 70s, the Pontiac Firebird, was supposed to be called Banshee. Even the name was taken away from DeLorean. When DeLorean left in 1973, one engineer was preparing to follow him out the door. His name was Bill Collins. Collins was the man who, 10 years earlier, had pointed at the Tempest's engine bay and said, "The 389 will fit." He was the engineer behind the Pontiac GTO. He was, by some accounts, the longest-serving engineer to work directly under DeLorean. They had built careers together. Collins was Pontiac's assistant chief engineer when DeLorean asked him to leave GM and help build the DMC-12. Collins said yes. But he had unfinished business first. 2 prototypes, the silver Banshee XP-833 hardtop and the white V8 convertible. Both cars were sitting in GM storage containers, untouched since 1965. Officially, they were scheduled to be sent to the crusher. That was what happened to most canceled prototypes. They were destroyed, so no rival manufacturer or magazine photographer could ever get their hands on them. But Collins couldn't let it happen. He walked into the GM purchasing department with a colleague named Bill Killen and made an offer. Sell us the prototypes, officially, privately, off the books. Somehow, he convinced them. Killen took the silver coupe with the OHC inline 6. Collins took the white convertible with the V8. But the cars had a problem. They didn't have names, just code numbers. XP-833 was an internal designation, meaningless to anyone who wasn't a GM engineer. If these cars were going to live outside the corporate world, they needed an identity. Collins remembered the Banshee II badges, the XP-798, the gullwing concept that James Roach had killed before the New York Auto Show, had left behind something. A small box of Banshee emblems made of polished metal, intended to be mounted on the body of a car that no longer existed. The XP-798 had been crushed, but the badges had survived. Collins picked up 2 of them. In 1971, in a small workshop, he placed a Banshee badge on each of the 2 XP-833 prototypes. He wasn't badge engineering. He wasn't trying to rewrite history. He was performing a small, private ceremony. The Banshee, the dream that had been killed 5 times, that had been handed to Chevrolet, that had been buried under a Pontiac Firebird name, was finally getting a proper grave marker. 2 cars, 2 badges, 1 gesture. It was the most quiet act of corporate rebellion in American automotive history. And it would be the only victory the Banshee ever got. This story has no revenge, no comeback, no third act where the heroes win. There is only silence. John DeLorean is gone. Bill Collins passed away in March 2023 at the age of 91. Pontiac is gone. The Banshee sits at a car show with no buyers. General Motors is still here. The Corvette is still being sold. A 2026 model is on display at every Chevrolet dealership in America, advertised as the pinnacle of American sports car engineering. 60 years have passed since that September 10, 1965 memo. The original copy is presumably sitting in an archive somewhere. A single piece of corporate paperwork that quietly redirected the course of American automotive history. 3 lines of typewritten text. That's all it took to take a Pontiac and turn it into a Chevrolet. That's all it took to push DeLorean toward the door. That's all it took to set in motion a chain of events that would end with a man selling watches on the internet, a brand being shuttered in a recession, and a one-of-a-kind silver coupe sitting unsold in a Connecticut garage with 1,498 miles on the clock. 3 lines of text. A man built a car. A company shut it down. An engineer rescued the badge. A name became a ghost. 60 years later, we're still telling their story. Maybe that's the only kind of victory that ever really mattered. The Pontiac Banshee never made it to a showroom. But you'll never look at a C3 Corvette the same way again. You'll never see a Pontiac Firebird without thinking about what it could have been called. You'll never watch Back to the Future without knowing why the man who built that car was never able to enjoy his own success. The Banshee was canceled 5 times, but its ghost is still driving. Through every Corvette, every Firebird, every Opel GT, every Fisker Karma. Through 60 years of American automotive history. Some cars get to be legends. The Banshee got to be something rarer. It got to be a haunting.